very good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? My name is Evan Cullen, and I've been asked by Gavin to introduce him this evening and also to launch his very splendid book. I was first introduced to Gavin about 6-7 years ago by way of a phone call. Back then I was the president of the Irish Airline Pilots Association, and I was at the time dealing with the crash of Rescue 116 at Black Rock Island just off the Belmullet coast in County Mayo. 2 IALPA members died in that crash. Gavin needed names, he needed information, he needed introductions, but one thing he didn't need was enthusiasm and passion to his investigation around the circumstances and contributing factors in the crash of St. Kevin, call sign Shamrock 165 in January 1952. In the interest of fairness and justice to the crew of St. Kevin, IALPA and I was more than willing to help out in any way we could. It was not lost on us that the pilots were members of IALPA. All too often in crash investigations, the powers that be seem to wish a narrative that saves money and gives an easy way out. This is particularly evident in the latest saga in Boeing, where you can see where the cultural differences of two merged entities have now come to the fore. But tonight we launch the third book in the trilogy of the St. Kevin. This launch is the culmination of almost 13 years of work, hundreds of hours of interviews, witnesses and technical experts. We can't speculate on what the motivations of the individuals in arriving at their conclusions were, but questions do remain about the conduct of the investigation and the inquiries do arise. Given the absence of speculation and the statements from the witnesses who were available to the investigation team, we must ask why these witness statements were excluded from the inquiry. This needs to be examined. We need to know how the investigation concluded St. Kevin was off course when the eyewitness statements conflict with such conclusions. It's my honour now to ask Gavin Walsh to present his findings and to launch this very comprehensive and wonderfully produced book. Thank you.
I assume I don't need to introduce myself to most people here. Some of you have been with me right from the get-go, and some of you have been over and back to Wales. As we all know, the St. Kevin came to grief on Thursday, January the 10th, 1952, amid a myriad of circumstances that all came together in what is typically known today as the perfect storm. But to get to the root of that perfect storm, we only have to go back in time about 18 months when the ticking time bomb was set to tick. And in the summer of 1950, a brain spark in Aer Lingus came up with a novel idea that they would cut from 3 to 2-man crews. They would lose the radio officer. And whilst this was the way the aviation world was going to go, there was one major difference. Aer Lingus set their eyes on the world's largest carrier, American Airlines. And they started to implement changes that American Airlines were then implementing. And the biggest change was to eliminate the radio officer. And the radio officer acted as a navigator. And there was one major difference. In America, they were rolling out VOR, omnidirectional range beacons, and with a 360-degree radial. But they didn't have these in Britain or Ireland at the time. But Aer Lingus had their eyes set on a bigger prize, which were the Viscounts, which were coming on stream. They thought they'd be there the next year. There was the inevitable delays, and they were 2 or 3 years later. So in that time span, Aer Lingus continued to use the DC-3 with the shortened crews from 3 to 2 men. This was fought by many people in the airline, including a man called Captain Tommy Hangley, who himself was no strange to controversy in Aer Lingus the following year. And his right-hand man was a man called Captain Joe Barrett, and his son is here with us tonight. And they vociferously fought this change, that it was too premature without proper beacons being in place. At the same time, the national airwaves in Britain were all devised and carved out on routes, and Aer Lingus, for reasons only known to Aer Lingus, but I suspect they were completely financial reasons, Aer Lingus decided to continue to fly what's known as the direct route, which was a shortcut across North Wales. And there was nothing wrong with flying that in weather conditions that were optimal or even average. But if the perfect storm hit, it was a dangerous place to be. And I don't know if any of you have read in Volume 2, I've shown where the airplane following the St. Kevin, which was the St. Coleman, came perilously close to crashing on more than one occasion. They fought for their lives, and the 7 conditions we identified that were there that night, we certainly know they were there for the St. Coleman, and they were likely there, if not even worse, 26 minutes earlier for the St. Kevin. And they were acute, severe to extreme turbulence. The problem with the turbulence was it would render the navigator would work, and he's gone in the first place, but when he was there, he worked in the station behind the cockpit. So if the turbulence was severe, the captain could not leave his workstation, could not leave his cockpit to operate this device. There was ferocious mechanical turbulence, which is turbulence off the hills, because these planes were unpressurized and flying between 4.5 and 8,500 feet. Gale force winds were in place that night, a raging storm with heavy showers and hailstones. Pitch black darkness and cloud with zero visibility, which created a potential for spatial disorientation, which was not much known about back then. Atmospheric electrical disturbances, which rendered literally the Nevin beacon out on the west coast of Wales, rendered it inoperable and rendered it actually useless. And prolonged severe clear icing, and the DC-3's worst foe was icing. And if all of those 7 conditions came together, which they did that night, a plane could be lost. As we know, it came to pass that night. Another sequence that came up to this was BEA, which was British European Airways, who owned 30% of Aer Lingus. They were aware of this, and they rapidly, any airplanes that they had, any of the DC-3s, they converted them into what are known as pioneers. So they left it that a captain could access navigational equipment without leaving his station. Now, this was offered to Aer Lingus, and very, very prophetically, ironically, sadly, whatever way you want to phrase it, it was offered to them by the BEA chairman, who was a man called Lord Sholto Douglas. He was one of Churchill's right-hand men in the war, and he actually flew to Aer Lingus to ask them to install this in their systems. And he was on the board of Aer Lingus by virtue of the fact that he was the chairman of BEA. But alas, Aer Lingus declined. We speculate in the book, and it's a very strong speculation, that they declined on the basis that they had pre-ordered Vickers Viscounts. And like any plane that's promised with a production line, the production line always falls behind. And that left a 2-year window. And in that 2-year window, on the night of January the 10th at 7:15 p.m, the perfect storm caught the St. Kevin and almost caught the St. Coleman at 7:40. The airline said that no pilot was ever pressured to fly this direct route, which was a shortcut. But in actual fact, the pressure was greatly on them, and it turned out that a very, very small percentage did not fly the direct route. The other route was to go up by beacons every 30, 40 miles apart. The beacon will keep you on track, and you navigate your way to Wallasey. There was a major beacon at Wallasey outside of Liverpool, and then you take what's called the Dog's Leg route, and you'd head left again, and you go straight out to Wales and out to sea and across into Dublin. So there were the circumstances that led to the almost inevitability that a plane could be lost. The problem that I have had for the last almost 13 years is, and it's basically the only problem I have with the whole thing, is not that the plane crashed. Accidents happen, as we know. The fact that when they investigated the crash, they needed to get the result they wanted, and they switched around things that came in from first of all, the inquiry itself. The investigation into the crash itself was nothing more than a complete sham. And then at that point, whatever they didn't get, when it went to a public board of inquiry, they substituted out answers to get the desired result they wanted. Now, obviously, the first thing you would think of is why did the witness statements were all discarded, by the way. They were just never brought. So obviously the first question is, well, what happened to witnesses? Well, nothing happened to them. They just lived on their lives, and they just assumed. It wasn't like it is today with social media, and with people didn't even have telephones. So when they were never asked to an inquiry, they just went on with their lives and forgot about it. And basically what happened was the investigators put the St. Kevin go wrong way. I know it's fantastical, but it's absolutely true, and it's all, I'm going to show you the proof of it now. This latest volume 3, illustrates several witness statements that were all discarded. And even before I ever had these, I from talking to, there's still people alive today who saw the plane in flames before it crashed. And even without these statements, which were hidden away by a policeman in Wales, I may not have had the confidence to stand up in front of you and say what I'm saying, but I knew it had been a complete cover-up. But the proof is given in these witness statements, and they're all pictured in this book. There's a man here, I have to talk about him, and his name was, Paddy, I think you may have flown with him, Captain R.N. Dick White.
Yeah.
A most honourable man.
White.
Yeah.
Gentleman.
Dick White questioned the entire event. He gave, I don't know how he was allowed to give evidence, but he was, and his evidence was diametrically opposed to all the experts of the day. And he put the St. Kevin off course, in other words, on course where it really was. And, you know, I don't mean to split a hair with this man, but his finding came in at 103 to 104 knots over the ground. Mine came in at 105, but we end up with the same result. And Captain White wrote to a meteorological magazine a year after the crash, and he asked the most bizarre question, which literally, when I read it, left the hairs on the back of my neck standing. And he said, what if the St. Kevin was never off course? He couldn't have said truer words, as I'm about to show you. So this is the morning after the crash, and these guys are police officers in the dark, and the white coat guys are RAF MRS, Royal Air Force Mountain Rescue Squad. One of whom one of these guys is from Sligo Town, Christy McCran. Obviously, we can't say which. And you can see them here. They're bending over, picking up debris. This is the tail of the plane. This is the morning. This is about 7 a.m. the morning after the crash. This is Moel Shabbat, and that's why the newspapers often erroneously said it crashed on Moel Shabbat. It actually crashed on a mountain called Cwm Edno. And Cwm Edno is on the shoulder, as you can see, of Shabbat. Shabbat is the large peak here. This is the bigwig himself, Lord Sholto Douglas. And this is him literally flying into Aer Lingus in the world's first modified DC-3, which has all the proper upgrades that a pilot cannot get lost. And this is the actual plane at Dublin Airport, and him trying to sell Aer Lingus, which he is on the board of, to take this new system. They didn't take it, and if they did, who knows? It's purely speculation. But the important thing to understand about Sholto Douglas, and this is anything emanating from what I'm about to say is speculation, but what I'm about to say now first is not speculation. It is a fact that Sholto Douglas was the chairman of BEA at the time of the crash and at the time of the investigation, and BEA had a 30% share in Aer Lingus, and Sholto Douglas, as part of that 30% deal, was on the board of Aer Lingus. So you can see how things would have gone the way that officialdom would have wanted them to go. This is actually, in my opinion, and in Captain White's opinion, and in all the witness evidence testimony opinion, this is the true path of the St. Kevin on the night. He turned here for reasons I'll come into in a minute, but this is what the inquiry arrived at. That he got lost. He had flown the route 650 times, and they never cut him an ounce of slack on that. They said he had got lost, he had misnavigated from here on, and they called it the drift. And he drifted the whole way off course and crashed here. None of this happened. What happened is he was on course, went through Harlech, he checked Nevin. Nevin is the important beacon out here, the one that didn't work in horrendous weather, or you didn't get the reading of it. And for some reason, and I personally suspect it was severe clear icing, he turned back here. On his turn back, to escape the icing, because the airline did have a strict rule: if you met icing going over the sea, turn back, do not cross the sea with icing. It's not like flying today, as Evan will understand. They're flying at 4,500 feet in an unpressurized airliner. He turned back here, and all the witnesses lived here that were all discarded. Okay? A power station here called Coomdilly Power Station. Everybody came out and saw the plane in its death throes. But what happened here? It clipped the flank of a mountain, and the starboard wing went on fire. And this is what all the witnesses saw, the plane going in a huge arc on fire, with everyone on board, unfortunately, going to their death. And the plane continued in a crippled manner, and somewhere about here, over Nant Gwinnant, for one of two reasons, the plane went into an ever-tightening starboard turn. And that turn was either for one of two reasons. It was either pilot-induced, where they were looking for a place to land. The weather was atrocious. They could not see anything. Or something had locked on the aileron in their start when they clipped that mountain, and they were caught in this ever-circling turn. And they went around this turn between 2 and 3 times. And the fire was growing and growing and growing on the wing, and eventually, boom. And that was about 1,500. I've ascertained it's in this story, pretty much the exact bandwidth, vertical-wise, that they exploded at. But the plane did explode mid-air, which the investigators never allowed for. And they said that what the people saw, they said that if anybody on the ground saw it, what they saw, the explosion, was the plane igniting, going into the bog hole. Well, anybody who's been up the mountaintop, and quite a few of you have, there's a huge ridge you go up and over. It's not possible. In fact, you identify here, there's only a handful there's no one could have seen it on planet Earth unless you were at the top of Snowdon at that time and the weather was crystal clear and you were looking straight at it. So what the people saw, this horrific explosion, was the St. Kevin exploding in mid-air after 3 or 4 terrifying minutes of being on fire and pretty much not in controllable flight. And this is a close-up of all the little place names, and these are all the witnesses, and they're all detailed here, and I'll go into quite a bit of trigonometry explaining how it was not possible for them to have seen anything but what they did see. In other words, the investigators told the lies. It turned out to be much easier retrospectively for me to show up their lies than it was for them to make those lies in the first place, if that makes sense. And another thing was they never gave Captain Keohane an ounce, not a millimetre of credibility. They said that he, even though he'd flown the route 650 times, for some reason he had missed his cues. He had completely stopped navigating his aircraft. I mean, it was a horrendous accusation, and found himself in this morass, or this soup, where the plane eventually crashed. They never allowed for the fact that the plane exploded mid-air. In fact, they categorically said that the plane arrived provenly intact at its final destination, and that the explosion was caused from it hitting the. Excuse me. They said that to add insult to injury, they said that Captain Keohane, when he realised that the soup he was in, that he had misnavigated his way into the leas and valleys of Snowdon, that he looked out, caught a glimpse of the ground. This is speculation, but this went down in the inquiry, point 7. He yanked on the control column and broke the starboard wing off. And that's how they explained away something that they could not get away from. And this is what they could not get away from. This is the wing here, as you can see. This is the crash site. This photograph is westbound. That's a perfect photograph. I know it's not perfect quality-wise, but it perfectly illustrates that the wing separated up in the sky. The distance here is 350 metres. Again, RAF men measured it the next morning. They have nothing. They have no skin in the game. Nothing to gain or lose by just telling it as it was. And these are the RAF maps. Snowdon is on again behind these ones, but this is westward. But this, ironically or perversely, played in the investigators' favour, that the St. Kevin was flying in the direction they put it at. It wasn't. It had come around in the 2 circles, and that just happened to be where it came to its demise. So again, wing and air wreckage, main wreckage. This is an overhead shot, and this one is this is a north-south photo. This is not. I just threw this in to give you an overall. These pictures were taken days after the crash, believe it or not, by a British military aircraft. And here's your wing. This is the Coomedno River, and we're on Coomedno Mountain. You can see one of Newton's laws kicks in classic here. When it meets something, everything goes flying forward. And again, you have it here, the wing. Same shot, obviously, different rotation, different angle. Now this is a very important map. This was Captain White, who I've already spoken of, who smelled a rat all along. Captain White produced his own map, and he arrived at this conclusion, that this was the true flight path of the St. Kevin, out to here. He did not offer any opinion as to anything turning back or whatever. But as you can see, he highlighted here the crash zone. And he worked out the different speeds as what it would take to get to where it got to. He told the inquiry, and how he was allowed to give evidence is beyond me, because everyone else's evidence was against Captain Keohane. But Captain White told the inquiry that he believed that Captain Keohane had reached Nevin and had radioed Nevin. Captain Keohane was never given that by the inquiry. They said he mistakenly thought he was at Nevin, thought he was out over the sea, but that he was lost in the mountains of Snowdon, lost here. And my argument has always been, why would Captain Keohane have checked Nevin if he wasn't at Nevin, unless he knew the plane was going to crash and he didn't want this outcome to come out the way it did? It makes no sense. In other words, Captain Keohane checked Nevin at 7:12 out here, but for some bizarre reason he turned back. Again, likely to be severe clear icing. These are the people, and I got these from Ancestry.com, people going in and out of America, as well as airline magazine clips. These are the people who were responsible for the 3 to 2 man cruise. So once they went down that road and they suffered a fatal crash, they had to stick with their plan, and the truth could not come out as to that they were carrying out an unsafe flying practice. And all of these documents are in the book, including all of the witness statements. I'm going to try and be very kind to this man. This is a very contentious character. This is a man called Richard O'Sullivan, Richard Whitledge O'Sullivan, and very contentious in that Captain Keohane, the following year Captain Tommy Handley, and 16 years later he managed to get rid of 46 statements pertaining to the Tusker Rock crash. All 46 were dismissed. They weren't disappeared. It wasn't like Wales where you're dealing with country people and no one to go and check up. They were entered into evidence and then they were discarded. He got the minister at the time to accept, and I clearly say why. In his report he said they were people who were ignoramuses going to mass and stuff like that, and he used that that terminology is in his crash report, which is available online. And I don't want to be unfair to this man because he was doing a job for someone else. So if we call Richard O'Sullivan the puppet, these are the puppeteers. This is Jeremiah Dempsey, long-time GM, General Manager, today CEO of Aer Lingus. This is Captain John Cecil Kelly Rogers. He was Winston Churchill's personal wartime pilot, a Dublin man from Malahide. And this is Captain Paget McCormick, who went on to work on Concorde. No disrespect to these three people, but these three people were responsible for the 3 to 2 man cruise. He came up with the idea. He looked it over, and this man implemented it as the CEO, as the GM would do. Now, back to the true direction of where the St. Kevin came from. This is a bizarre story of this man. His name is Owen Roberts, and he started turning up huge pieces of wreckage right along the route that I had come up with, that Captain White had come up with 70 odd years earlier, and his pieces are almost fit the pattern as to the true final direction of the aircraft. In other words, Jimmy Keohane was never off course, and those pieces are still on the mountaintop today. In fact, some of you saw this piece here only last September, October. When I contacted the people who investigated the accident were the AIB, the Accident Investigation Bureau in Britain. Today it's known as the AAIB, but it's the same body. So when I contacted them as to the man who was in charge, the field investigator of the St. Kevin, is a man called, an Irishman from Howth called John W. Duggan. They took me about 10 questions, and I actually had to almost threaten in a nice way that I'd go down the FOI road if they didn't. But this is the response I got that the very limited information on him. He may have worked estimated in 1953. Well, we know the crash happened in 52. And that was that is John Duggan, and they never heard of Mr. Pike, the guy who worked with him. So on the 1st of December gone by, the AAIB contacted me formally to tell me that they were going to basically investigate my investigation of their investigation from 70 years earlier. And in hindsight, they basically strung me along for 2 or 3 months. And in the end, they came back on the 5th of March gone by and pretty much blew me out with this letter, which is that if you go into the definition of the word recusal, this is it. At no point did they find any problem with any of my findings, and I'd spent 236 pages basically destroying their inquiry and the investigative process that led to the inquiry. At no point do they touch on anything I've said in it. They purely go into legalities and etc., etc. So that's where things are at with them, but we'll be taking it to the next step. So this was the mountaintop. This photograph was taken in the summer of 1975. And this remained like this till September 13, 1980. Now, I don't know if any of you know this, that were up with us last September. They cleared off the crash site on September 13, 1980. But when I say cleared, I know the man who did it, and I have all the photos of it. They went down 3 feet, and then they sealed the hole. So the entire plane, with the occupants, including Captain Keohane, and their personal belongings and luggage and wings and engines, are still in the bog today. But on September 13, 1980, the story broke in the media that there was a plane raising itself from the bog in the hot summers. So they went over and they literally cleared the 3 feet I've told you about, and this was taken away. I've been up to the crash site at least 40 times, and I've never seen anything. But last September 30, when we all went up for the private launch of this book, I'm sure some of you have seen it, we found loads of bits of aircraft, some of them substantially heavy. It's like they gave themselves up, if that makes sense to you. And I had never seen that before. But this is the plane, this is 1975, but that was there till 1980, as it is there. So I just would like to tell you one short story with regard to this man here. This man has become my... not personally, but his finds have become to me my pillar of strength. And he knew nothing about me. I knew nothing of him. And the government in Wales, on December 6, 2020, the government in Wales allowed people out for a weekend with the COVID, and you could climb the mountain. And a friend, a pair of twins who you've all met, one of them went up the mountain and went on a very, very unusual way called the Rid Du Path. It's the rarest of the 7 paths up Snowdon. And as she was coming to the top, she heard a man explaining to these tourists, pointing and saying, and the little girl is still in the airplane. Now this girl knows me because her partner, who died sadly 10 years ago, he got the only memorial stone to the St. Kevin ever, John Roberts. And she waited till he explained to the tourists whatever he was explaining. She said, "Excuse me, are you talking about an Irish plane?" He said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Have you heard of Gavin Walsh?" "I have not," he said. You must bear in mind that I've only ever had private launches in the last 13 years. And she said to me, "You have to talk to this guy. He's writing a trilogy of books on this crash." So they ended up becoming pals, and they went back the mountain together, and then they came down together, and she explained all this to him about me, what I had been doing. We were put in touch shortly thereafter, and he tells me he's finding these pieces, and I said, no. And he's telling me the size of them that he's finding, and that he's had them investigated. He had an air mechanic from RAF Valley brought up, and he was able to tell from the stringers on it that it's a civilian aircraft and likely off a DC-3. So this was just bizarre that this guy had come up with all this wreckage. And I only ever had a conversation with this guy over the month of December 2020. So I went back to the US, and in January this guy contacts me in a panic and says, "Please call me quick." So I call him, and he said, I'm allowed to go outside of the COVID zone to get medication for my wife. So he went to Keohane instead of his own little small village, and whilst there he went into a supermarket, and a guy came up and tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Are you the guy finding the pieces of the Aer Lingus plane?" And he said, "I am." Well, he said, "You need to get in touch with a guy in Ireland called Gavin Walsh." And he said, I'm already in touch with him for this past month, only by telephone. And the man's name is David Ellis, who had stopped him in the supermarket. And he said, "Tell Gavin Walsh, call me. It was my uncle that was one of the witnesses that was sent to London, that was assessed to give evidence, de-assessed not to give it, and reassessed by the British doctor to go down and give evidence. And he went to London, and untold your evidence is no longer required." So that's the kind of shenanigans went on. And that witness's name, by the way, was Edward Salisbury Williams, and his statement is in here, and his picture is in here. So in essence, all of the witness statements disappeared. And there were a lot. I've only got, I believe, 11. There were a lot more than 11. There was about 20 taken, but the only ones I have are the police ones. The ones Aer Lingus took, and the ones the AIB today, the AAIB took, all destroyed. And again, I'm not going to speculate on why they were destroyed, but they were destroyed, and that speaks of bad taste in itself. My beef is purely, after 13 years' work, my beef is purely to get point 7 removed from the British government's finding, which basically stated that Captain Keohane and the flight crew committed gross misnavigation errors when they never were where they said they were. As you can see, the AAIB think they've blown me out. The reality is that their senior inspector didn't even, their own inspector didn't even investigate the crash. That again, I can't speculate, but I'll leave that to your imagination. A Dublin man was brought in, and ironically, there were Irish investigators on the mountaintop before the British ever even got there. That night, Duggan and 6 major players out of Aer Lingus, 7 major players, were all on the mountaintop that night. So you know, it wasn't for any good reason, we can say. I would just like to finally appeal to Mr. Chris Benor, if he ever gets to see this video. He is the chief inspector in the Air Crash Division in the Air Accident Investigation Bureau in Britain. And while I'm at it, I'd also like to throw in a man called Mr. Kevin O'Callaghan in our own Air Accident Investigation Unit. And what I say to them is very simply this: why not look at my findings? I have no skin in this game. I have nothing to lose, nothing to gain. Why not look at my findings? Give them 5 minutes. I've given it 13 years. There's nothing here made up. There's nothing bent to fit. They're all facts. I know, Mr. Orr, you think that you're not liable because it was your predecessor, but it was still that body under government jurisdiction. I ask of you to just look at what I have to say. Look at what my book says. The evidence is unequivocal that Captain Keohane never was where you guys put him at. And that's it. Okay? Any questions?
No, just to clarify again, when you mentioned that the witness statements that the AAIB and the inquiry all disappeared,
Mm-hmm.
the reason you got the other 11 was because the same witnesses had already given statements to the local police before the investigation started.
Thanks. Yeah, the policeman in Wales was obviously a duty-bound, run-of-the-mill, honest, ordinary cop. The same as if someone was killed in a car crash, he'd go out and he'd investigate. He went out the next day and he interviewed everybody in the valley. He spent the next 2 days. And again, my argument is very simple. Why would these people tell lies? They have nothing to gain from it. In fact, so little had they to gain from it that when their statements were never used, they never even followed it up. They were honest. They gave their answer on the day, and then it was completely discarded. And again, you can only arrive at the worst possible conclusion as to why their statements were discarded.
But those people probably never knew that their statements were.
They probably were never blissfully unaware of it. Is correct. Yeah. Some of these people couldn't even speak English, believe it or not, back in the 1950s. So. Yes.
Have you raised this at any political level?
That's a fantastic question, and the answer to that is very simply no. But if Mr. Chris Benor and hopefully his counterpart here in Ireland, because I have to say the Department of Industry and Commerce, which is today under the auspices of the AAIU, back then they put Richard O'Sullivan, the stooge, out to do the dirty work. So that's a fantastic question, and ostentatious and all as this is going to sound to all of you, and I hope you're going to be in my corner, because this is our last chance. The only way to get this to a political level is to garner up 100,000 signatures. And if you think that's so out there, it was done with the Chinook crash, and once it made it to the floor of the Commons, they had to reopen the investigation, and that too, that's only 1994, that was a complete, total and cover-up where they blamed the pilots instead of the equipment. So that is, does that answer your question? That's probably the route I'm going to have to go down, because you can see from that very well drafted letter from Mr. Orr that it's nothing more than a letter of recusal, where his predecessor, who was at the helm, Mr. Eric Newton, a very honest man by all means, he just never took any part in this crash, so he obviously didn't want to get his hands dirty, and he excused himself, and his predecessor has now recused himself. So, and I stand saying that, and I say that in public to them. So, anybody else?
Well,
do you understand that this wreckage and all its occupants were left in place?
Correct. The St. Kevin lies intact in a bog, in a mountaintop, far from home, in a lonely mountaintop, far from home. I have the coroner's reports, and I promised I would never be graphic, and I never will be. And you can see they're fairly clean books. But I know exactly what was got off each person. And some of the people that came home, they talk of 10 funerals. It wasn't people came home. It was minuscule, and I would guesstimate that as much as 80 to 90% by volume, not by weight or mass, but by volume, of the human beings on board the St. Kevin are still in the bog. What condition they're in, I have no clue, because you've got lots of stuff going on in all those years. So you might have acidity from the bog instead of the usual protection from a dry bog. So,
But quite apart from the human side, there was no attempt to reconstruct the wreckage or...
No. I've actually named the people who sealed the hole, and they were Aer Lingus employees. And I named the time they sealed it at, because there was a policeman. I'm never going to say where I got all these documents. I got a phenomenal 1,064 documents. But there was a policeman in there was a policeman in North Wales, and he documented everything. And I got his logbook, and he even documents who gave the order to seal off the crash site. And it was an Aer Lingus senior executive, and that's how it went. I have to say the airline would have been terribly embarrassed by this crash. 14 months to the very night, on the 10th of November 1950, Aer Lingus had been declared the world's safest airline. So this came home. This couldn't have come at a worse time, and it was a classic case of batten down the hatches and deny, and just hope it'll be a 3-day press run, which is basically what it was. It was a flash in the pan, and within, I know for an absolute fact that on the year after the crash, Aer Lingus forbade all employees from putting in memorial notices to Deirdre Sutton, and that's dealt with in Volume 2. And her former employer, PIMS stepped to the mark, and they put in the memorial notice. And it's, the word presentism comes to mind. I'm not going to judge our beloved national airline, who we're extremely proud of, and again I say that with sincerity. You cannot judge today on yesterday. Things were done differently, but all I would seek is that people would at least own up and have the decency to look at the factors surrounding this crash, and admit it if they got it wrong, or if their predecessors got it wrong, because it is not the people in power today that obviously, but the buck has to stop with somebody. And in my opinion, the closest person the buck stops with here is Mr. Chris Benore in the AAIB, which is the same body. It was set up in 1919, and as it's the same body as the AIB, except in November 1987 they put an extra A into their AIB to make it AAIB. Same body, same everything. So,
have you heard at all as to why Aer Lingus in their 75th anniversary booklet doesn't mention the crash?
Well, I have to minutely correct you. They do mention it. They don't index it. They do vaguely mention it, and they do index Tusker, and they obviously can't get away from Tusker, and they spend a page on Tusker. They do mention it in a paragraph. But I would like to say this, and thanks to my mother. My mother bought me that book coming home from Portugal on a 75th anniversary. Aer Lingus were naturally flogging their book, and my mother bought it for me and handed it to me, and I'm not going to read it. Not Aer Lingus, any airline. I'm not going to go reading the workings of an airline. I'm not interested. But I did go straight to the book, because I've been obsessed with St. Kevin from when I was 10 years of age. And I did go to the back of the book, and there was nothing there. And I said to my mother, "Oh my God!" And I went straight down to Michael Keohane, Castle Street. He was here, Michael. And I went straight to Michael's shop, and Michael had a copy under the counter, because I used to chat with him about St. Kevin. And he said, "Look at this. My uncle and these people airbrushed from history, and not a single mention. It is a mention, but it's very oblique and it's vague, and it's not in the index." I just want to be particular on that point. And that was one of the incipient factors that got me to tell the St. Kevin story, was it not being in that book. Had it been in it, we wouldn't be here today. Had they just mentioned it, we wouldn't be here today, and hopefully on the cusp of overturning that verdict. But it's just something my mother touched on there, and I would like to make this appeal. Again, back to Mr. Chris Benore, and from an Irishman to an Englishman, I would say this to him, that a fellow Irishman at the age of 17 or 18 volunteered, joined the RAF, Captain Jimmy Keohane, was a war hero and was only acknowledged as recently as 2004 in a book by a man called Alan Bird called Coastal Command for carrying out daring runs, and they're all in Jimmy Keohane's chapter here. So this man goes and he fights for a foreign land, which England was at that time, and puts his life on the line. And then he dies in a very tragic crash. And not only is he left where he has been left, he's blamed for misnavigational errors. I mean, for God's sake, can nobody reach into their heart and soul and rectify this, or even come and disprove me? And I throw down the challenge to the AAIB and the AAIU, because they have a role to play in this, because the Department of Industry was their predecessor and they sent out Richard O'Sullivan to do this dirty work. And I challenge them, come and talk to me, And let's right the wrong instead of for a long protracted battle. Because God help me if I'd spend the next 13 years getting 100,000 signatures, but do what I will.
Worse still, there was no pension given to the widow.
Well, there's a very special man up the front here, Paddy Donoghue, who got Mrs. Keohane her pension, albeit 22 years later when he...
22 years later.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Paddy, for turning up.
Well done.
Have I missed anything or any final questions?
Maybe just to thank the people of Keohane who got the plaque and memorial put on in place up at the top of the mountain.
That'd be John Roberts.
John Robertson.
Yeah, John Roberts was a very special character. I've dedicated Volume 3 to him. He spent 10 years harassing Aer Lingus for a plaque, and he finally got it. But he got it under very limited circumstances. There's no Aer Lingus, there's no passengers' names, there's nothing. And I have the internal memos that Aer Lingus and him sent to each other, because John was very obsessive. He recorded everything. And some of those letters make for striking reading. What in terms of that the airline didn't want this story to come out, but it's out now and that's it. Sorry, you were going to say there was someone had a question here.
Sorry, Gavin, I was going to ask. I think you answered it. In fact, your last comment. If you did get the inquiry reopened,
Yes.
what would be a satisfactory outcome for you?
For me, just erase point 7 from the British government inquiry, and I will go back under the stone I crawled out from 13 years ago, and they'll never hear from me again. And I mean that very sincerely. Just come investigate. Am I right or wrong on point 7? And if I'm right, overturn it. Because if you Google the ICAO's official cause of the St. Kevin crash, it will come down to those words, those succinct words that Captain Keohane brought his aircraft off course. Never happened. Or else all the witnesses all lied. And I spent 13 years telling lies. So.
And we met people who in the underage cried because they hadn't been believed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's quite a few of them. Not quite a few, there's a small number of them still alive. One of them actually saw the plane explode over his house. He died since, William Williams, but I have his testimony and I have his origin. More importantly, his statement is in there. And, that's about it, guys.
Thank you.
Sir?
Just one thing,
Yes.
myself and Kevin Webb are here, we're on the committee of the retired airline pilots.
Yeah, and thank you, Paddy Kilduff, and the rest of you guys for making it here.
Just an interesting link, you're probably aware of it, or possibly are.
Yes.
We inherited some material from IALPA, the Pilots Association, for our own archives, and discovered a commercial pilot's license there from the 50s in the name of Richard Laker.
Richard Laker gets about 40 pages in Volume 3. Richard Laker was a senior Aer Lingus captain. He was also a war hero. The bulk of him is in the bog. I say that because I know what went home to Midhurst in England. I've been to Richard Laker's grave about 12 or 15 times. It's the nicest cemetery on planet Earth, by the way, if you're a cemetery lover like I am. Richard Laker's brother, Victor Laker, knew this whole thing was a stitch-up. And you'll read about Victor Laker in here. The police were sent around to put the squeeze on him at one point. There's an entire chapter dedicated to internal police memos from Wales, from London CID to the top guy. Why are we investigating this guy? Going back across to the top guy in Wales who's put them out by a corrupt lawyer in Caernarvon called Appy Hughes. No problem naming him. He's gone anyway since, but he was the lawyer who put a lot of this stitching up into place. And Victor Laker spent years trying to get to the bottom of this. He got so close, but he never did it. He never had if he had the witness statements, he'd have done it, but he didn't have them.
Yeah. For some reason, his license ended up back with the pilots.
Nicky Laker, yeah, Richard Laker, yeah.
Actually, we have that license.
Richard Laker was the most qualified in terms of prolific types of aircraft types. Nicky Laker was the most qualified Aer Lingus captain by far. He had flown, I believe I pictured at least 5 different types of fighter and bomber aircraft he flew in the war. In fact, he was deemed as so good he was pulled and put into Cambridgeshire to train pilots because they were going to their deaths, the poor young men. And the other person that I need to speak of is Alec Newman. Alec Newman was the first officer of the St. Kevin. He was an RAF hero. So these are 3 RAF heroes, 3 Aer Lingus pilots left in a bog, put off course. And we can say, and this is speculation, but I'm willing to bet my life on it, Nicky Laker was in the cockpit with them when they crashed. Because I have spoke to several people in the business, and the one thing that's given, and I'd like to think if Paddy and Evan have anything to throw in here, throw it in. If a crisis emanates on board a plane, if there's a guy deadheading in the back, that's a pilot travelling, he will go up front and assist them in any way he can. And I have absolutely no doubt that Nicky Laker was in the front with them when they got into this terrible melee of going around in circles. The reason I say it with confidence is because what was found of him was found beside Newman. Newman and Laker, parts of them were found. And there was also a radio telephony book found close to them. And that would possibly be where they were trying to look up something to find how they could find where they were. You must remember there was no Captain Keohane was qualified in navigation. Alec Newman was not. And Aer Lingus did concede that at the inquiries. The only thing went against them was that they let one of the 2 pilots fly when he wasn't qualified as a navigator. And what the promise they had given when they pulled the 3 to 2 man cruiser, that no flight would go unless both pilots could use were radio telephony qualified, is the word I'm looking for. Does that, I'm sorry if I went a roundabout way, but Nicky Laker was a great character, yeah.
Obviously well aware of him, yeah.
Very well, and I believe he's got 40-something pages here, so. Yes, Richard, sorry.
With modern technology, would it not be possible to recover, like, bodies or the wreckage? Or
I believe it would be, but...
Have there been no attempts to? Or
no.
Would family members not want that, maybe?
I've always been wary of being asked this question, and because it's not emotional for me, but it's very emotive for the families, and I don't have an opinion on it, but I believe that if the AAIB do properly reinvestigate it, they won't be going to families for permission. And the landowner today is the grandson of the landowner back then. He has told me that let people do what they have to do, which means going up on his land, visiting the grave, the mass grave, or whatever. He will be fully cooperative. His grandfather was not, by the way, but that's another story. That's covered in here as well. But I have to just say, I did go and live in Wales for periods of time, and when you live with the people, they tell you things that they wouldn't tell you when you're an outsider, and you get a lot of things told to you, the idiosyncrasies and the personalities of the people involved. But overall, the people of Cairnarvon loved the deceased members of the St. Kevin. And that's evidence in a lot of photographs here where you'll see them in their hundreds turning up at the mass funerals. And to this day, they still put flowers on the grave. And to this day, people go up and clean the headstone, the memorial stone on the mountaintop. So.
The shepherd.
Yeah, and he's the man called Gwyn Ross Jones who witnessed the crash. A lot of these people are still alive. And if any of you are signed up to the mail shots I bang out, you'll see that I've done interviews with these people at different launches along the way. So, okay.
The people of Cairnarvon for years held an anniversary mass on the day.
Yes, correct, yeah. And there's people on the anniversary to this day. David Ellis, whose uncle was turned back, he goes up. Owen Roberts, John Ellis Roberts, who got the memorial stone. Now, these are all independent of each other. They go up on the day, or give or take a day either side of it. So they're not forgotten about. In North Wales, they were forgotten about in Ireland, other than by their own immediate families, obviously. But I hope we remember them here tonight and that they didn't die in vain. Okay? Just to say, there's going to be teas and coffees, and Brenda, I believe, keeping with tradition, is going to be behind the little chair, the little table there, if anybody would like to purchase a book. Doing them €40 special price, and the trilogy, there's not many left of volume 1 and 2, and doing the full 3 I think for 90. So okay, thanks everybody for turning up.
Before everybody just gets up from the seat.
Oh yes.
As a family member, it was my father who was killed. I'm very emotional about that.
I'm going to tell them your name while you gather yourselves. This is Bill Good, and his father was on the same cabin.
We owe Gavin in North deep gratitude for actually doing what he's done. He spent 13 years of his life. Nobody else could do it. He's got a brain that actually I just can't keep up with.
Yeah, but I also suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder, so I couldn't get away from it once it locked onto me.
And we owe him an enormous gratitude. He really has done such fantastic work for us, and the story would never come out without you, Gavin.
Well, I appreciate it, and I will agree that if I hadn't stumbled on, you see, before I ever got the statements, I have to say something here, and I'm not going to say who he was, but on Friday, October 5th, 2012, I'm sorry, but my head works with numbers, and it's much easier just to not even put in October, just say 05102012. But anyway, on that particular date, a person approached me and said, would you like to see a lot of documents that might upset you and as to your own narrative on this crash? And what I was shown were perfect, that they matched into what all the people had been telling me on the ground. All of a sudden everything was not this way, it was that way. And when we finished up, we went back to Betsy Coyett, Aberfran Hotel, and when we went back there, this man said these words to me. He said, are you anxious about what you've seen? I said, very much so. He said, are you frightened? I said, not really. And he said, will you see it through? I said, I think I will. Well, that was 12 years ago. And here we are today. So
I'd just like to, as another posthumous daughter of a passenger, I just want to second you.
Oh, thanks, Phyllis. Phyllis and Bill are posthumous children of St. Keohane, as I call them, St. Keohane, and so it's very special to have you here. I hope you weren't insulted by my silly little mathematical thing about the running of your name, your initials, 1 in 12 million or something.
It's the sort of thing that your brain can do, no?
Whatever, yeah. Yeah, it's been a long road, but it's been a great journey, and there's a lot of people I have to thank here, my mother and Clinton, and a whole lot of people that aren't here, and people, everything that I needed turned up as and when I needed it. I never got too much, I never got excess, I didn't win the lottery yet, but every time I needed something, it was there for me. And I would actually almost internally snare if somebody denied me something, because I'd have it within 3 or 4 days. I know that sounds bizarre. There was nothing I was not given that I did not need to bring the story to its final conclusion. So let's move on now and try and get point 7 removed.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Okay?
Well done.
Happy enough, yeah?
Yeah, very good.
Thank you, Paddy. You want to have some tea?